At my wife's company's IPO celebration, I had planned to reveal that I was the heir to a billionaire fortune and announce our relationship to the world. Then I walked in and saw my wife and her coworker on her office bed. You know that moment when you're about to drop the mic on your entire life, and then life decides to drop a nuclear bomb on you instead? Yeah, that was my Tuesday night. I stood outside the Grand Meridian Ballroom, adjusting my tie for the third time like some nervous freshman at prom. The marble floors were so shiny I could see my reflection staring back at me. Confident smile, perfectly pressed tuxedo, and the kind of swagger that comes from knowing you're about to blow everyone's minds. Tonight wasn't just about Rosewood Tech going public. Tonight was my night to finally step out of the shadows and show this city exactly who the hell I really was. For 7 goddamn years, I'd been playing the role of supportive husband while bankrolling Sophia's tech dreams. 7 years of watching her take credit for strategies I'd whispered in her ear over morning coffee. 7 years of nodding along while investors praised her vision that I'd literally sketched out on napkins during our anniversary dinners. But hey, love makes you do stupid things, right? And I was stupider than most. The ballroom doors swung open, and I got hit with that familiar cocktail of expensive perfume, champagne bubbles, and the kind of fake laughter that only comes from people who measure their worth in stock options. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen fireworks above a sea of black tuxedos and designer gowns. Every tech blogger, venture capitalist, and social media influencer in the tri-state area was crammed into this overpriced fishbowl, all waiting for the big announcement. I worked the crowd like I'd been doing it my whole life, which, technically, I had. Growing up as a Vance meant you learned to schmooze before you learned to tie your shoes. But tonight felt different. Tonight, I wasn't just the mysterious husband who somehow managed to keep Rosewood's books balanced and their investors happy. Tonight, I was going to reveal that the guy who'd been pulling strings behind the scenes was actually the heir to one of the biggest fortunes on the East Coast. There he is. Marcus Webb from TechCrunch grabbed my shoulder like we were old fraternity brothers instead of acquaintances who'd shared maybe 5 conversations. Ready for the big show? Sophia must be over the moon. I flashed him that practice smile, the one I'd perfected during countless charity galas and board meetings where I'd sat quietly while grown men threw tantrums over quarterly projections. She's been working toward this moment her whole career, I said, which wasn't technically a lie. Sophia had been working, just not as hard as she wanted everyone to believe. The lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the crowd like someone had hit the universal mute button. This was it, the moment I'd been rehearsing in mirrors for weeks. I'd written the speech myself, humble but confident, grateful but ambitious. I was going to stand beside my wife, announce the IPO, and then casually mention that, oh yeah, by the way, I'm not just some random dude who married well. I'm a Vance, as in Vance Industries, as in the family that's been moving money around this country since before your great-grandfather was figuring out how indoor plumbing worked. The spotlight hit the stage, and my heart did this weird little skip thing that reminded me why I usually avoided public speaking. But then I saw her, and everything else faded into background noise. Sophia looked absolutely stunning. Her red dress hugged her curves like it had been painted on, and her hair cascaded over her shoulders in those perfect waves that probably cost more than most people's rent. She was glowing. Literally glowing in a way that made every camera in the room start clicking like hungry piranhas. But she wasn't alone. Brian Carter stood beside her, his arm threaded through hers like they were posing for their engagement photos. Brian fucking Carter, the guy who'd been sniffing around our company like a lost puppy for the past 6 months. This strategic partner who couldn't balance a checkbook if his life depended on it, but somehow had convinced half of Silicon Valley that he was the next Steve Jobs. My stomach dropped somewhere around my knees, but I kept that smile plastered on my face because 300 people were watching, and at least 50 of them had cameras pointed in my direction. Sophia stepped up to the microphone, and her voice rang out clear and confident across the ballroom. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight for what has truly been a labor of love. She paused, letting the anticipation build like she was announcing the Oscar for Best Picture. Rosewood Tech is officially going public, and I couldn't be more thrilled to share this moment with my incredible team and our amazing strategic partner, Brian Carter. Polite applause rippled through the crowd, but I was barely hearing it. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. This wasn't the script we'd rehearsed. This wasn't how tonight was supposed to go. And then she dropped the bomb. But that's not the only exciting news we have to share tonight. Her smile got even brighter, if that was physically possible, and her hand moved to rest on her stomach in a gesture so subtle that most people probably missed it. But I didn't miss it. I never missed anything when it came to Sophia. My blood turned to ice water. The pregnancy rumors that have been circulating are absolutely true. Her voice carried across the room like a victory song, and Brian squeezed her arm in what I'm sure was meant to look supportive, but just looked possessive. And Brian is the father. The world stopped. Just fucking stopped. Every sound in the ballroom, the clinking glasses, the whispered conversations, the clicking cameras, got muffled like someone had shoved cotton in my ears. My hand started trembling, and I had to grip my champagne flute so tight I was surprised it didn't shatter. But I clapped. God help me, I clapped. Because that's what you do when your wife announces to 300 strangers that she's pregnant with another man's baby. You smile, and you clap, and you pretend like your entire world didn't just get fed through a wood chipper on live television. The cameras swiveled toward me like vultures circling a fresh carcass. I could feel every eye in the room boring into me, waiting for my reaction. Waiting to see if the cuckold husband would break down, or throw a punch, or do something dramatic enough to make it onto the entertainment blogs by morning. Instead, I raised my champagne flute in a toast that probably looked gracious from the outside, but felt like swallowing glass on the inside. Congratulations, I managed to say, and my voice only cracked a little bit. The applause got louder, more enthusiastic, like everyone was suddenly very interested in celebrating this beautiful moment of betrayal and humiliation. Sophia beamed at the crowd, soaking up their approval like a plant that hadn't seen sunlight in months. And me? I stood there in my perfectly pressed tuxedo, surrounded by people who were supposed to be celebrating my success, watching my wife claim another man's child while the cameras captured every second of my public emasculation. 7 years. 7 fucking years of building her dream, financing her vision, and believing in our partnership. 7 years of being the man behind the woman, content to let her shine while I pulled the strings from the shadows. Tonight was supposed to be different. Tonight was supposed to be mine. Instead, I got erased from my own story while the whole world watched. You know what's funny about public humiliation? The show must go on. Even after your wife announces she's carrying another man's baby in front of half the tech industry, you still have to shake hands and make small talk like your soul didn't just get put through a blender. I managed to slip away from the ballroom after what felt like 17 hours, but was probably closer to 30 minutes of the most excruciating social performance of my life. The valet brought my BMW around, and I sat in the driver's seat for a solid 5 minutes, just breathing and trying to figure out what the hell had just happened to my life. My phone started buzzing before I even pulled out of the parking lot. Text after text lighting up my screen like a goddamn Christmas tree. Dude, what the hell was that? Asterisk, Marcus from TechCrunch, probably already writing his exclusive expose. Call me ASAP. Asterisk, my assistant Sarah, who was definitely not getting paid enough to deal with this level of drama. Congratulations on the IPO. Asterisk, some investor who clearly hadn't been paying attention to the second half of the announcement. Bro, you okay? Asterisk, my college roommate Jake, who lived in Denver and somehow still heard about my personal disasters faster than I did. I turned the phone face down and drove home in blessed silence, trying not to think about the fact that every entertainment blogger and tech journalist in the city was probably crafting headlines about my spectacular public cuckolding. Tech heir's wife announces affair baby at IPO launch. Vance Fortune can't buy loyalty. Rosewood CEO trades up from husband to strategic partner. Yeah, that last one was definitely going to be a real headline by morning. Our house. Correction, Sophia's house that I'd been paying the mortgage on for the past 3 years. Looked exactly the same as when I'd left it 6 hours ago. Same perfectly manicured lawn, same pretentious fountain that cost more than most people's cars, same marble lions flanking the front door because apparently my wife thought we lived in some kind of modern-day Downton Abbey. But walking through that front door felt like entering a crime scene. Everything looked normal on the surface, but I knew that underneath all the expensive furniture and designer artwork, something had died tonight. Something that had been sick for a while, probably, but I'd been too stupid or too stubborn to put it out of its misery. I poured myself 3 fingers of the good scotch, the 25-year-old Macallan that I'd been saving for tonight's celebration, and sat in my leather chair, staring at the family photos scattered across the mantel. Most of them were from our early days, back when Sophia still looked at me like I hung the moon instead of like I was a convenient ATM with legs. There was one from our wedding day, both of us grinning like idiots who thought love could conquer basic arithmetic. Another from our honeymoon in Tuscany, where she'd whispered all her dreams about building a tech empire that would change the world. I'd believed in those dreams. Hell, I'd bankrolled those dreams with everything I had. The scotch burned going down, but it was a good burn. The kind that reminded you that you were still alive, even when everything else suggested otherwise. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a call, not a text. Unknown number, which meant it was probably some reporter who'd gotten hold of my private line. I let it go to voicemail, then immediately regretted it because now there was going to be a permanent record of whatever vulture was circling my personal tragedy. Around midnight, I heard the front door open, high heels clicking on marble, followed by deeper footsteps and the kind of drunken laughter that makes you want to punch something expensive. I didn't need to look to know that Sophia had brought Brian home with her. My home. The home I'd bought, furnished, and maintained while she played CEO with my money. They stumbled into the living room like a couple of teenagers sneaking in past curfew, except teenagers usually have the decency to be quiet about it. Brian was loosening his tie and grinning like he'd just won the lottery, which, let's be honest, he basically had. Sophia was giggling, actually giggling like some sorority girl instead of the supposedly brilliant businesswoman who'd just announced the biggest IPO of the year. Oh. She stopped when she saw me sitting in the dark with my scotch. You're still awake. Hard to sleep after a night like tonight, I said, keeping my voice level. No point in giving them more ammunition. Brian had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable, but only slightly. Hey man, no hard feelings about earlier, right? Business is business. Business is business. This jackass was talking about knocking up my wife like it was a merger and acquisition deal. Right? I said, taking another sip of scotch. Business. Sophia kicked off her heels and immediately became 3 inches shorter and somehow more dangerous. She had this look on her face, the same look she got when she was about to fire someone or negotiate a deal that would leave the other party wondering what the hell had just happened to them. We need to talk about sleeping arrangements, she said, like she was discussing quarterly budget allocations. Brian's going to be staying here for a while, and he needs the bed. I almost laughed. Almost. The bed. Our bed. She clarified, though the way she said our made it clear that she was using the royal plural. You can take the couch tonight. We'll figure out something more permanent tomorrow. The couch. In my own house. The house I'd bought for us, for our future, for the family I thought we were building together. The house where I'd carried her over the threshold like some romantic fool who believed in happily ever after. Brian was already heading toward the stairs, apparently taking her suggestion as a done deal. He paused at the bottom step and looked back at me with something that might have been pity if it wasn't wrapped in so much smugness. Thanks for being cool about this, man. Not every guy would handle it so well. Like I was some kind of saint for not burning the house down around all of us. Don't mention it, I said, and I meant it. Don't fucking mention it to anyone, ever, because I was already going to be the punchline of enough jokes without adding more material. They disappeared upstairs, and I listened to their footsteps cross the hardwood floor of what used to be our bedroom. The bed creaked, my bed, the one I'd picked out and paid for, and I heard Sophia's laugh again, softer this time, but somehow more intimate. I sat there in the dark for another hour, nursing my scotch and thinking about the pregnancy test I'd found in the bathroom trash 3 weeks ago. I'd been so goddamn happy when I saw those 2 pink lines. So stupidly, blindly happy. I'd even gone out and bought a bottle of champagne to surprise her when she was ready to tell me. The champagne was still in the wine fridge, right next to the bottle I'd been saving for the IPO celebration. Seemed like I wasn't going to need either one of them anymore. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the texts I'd been ignoring. Most of them were from people who wanted the inside scoop on tonight's drama, but a few were genuine. My dad had called twice, no messages, but I could imagine what he wanted to say. My sister had sent a simple, call me when you're ready. Even my college roommate Jake had followed up his initial text with seriously, bro, whatever you need. But I wasn't ready to talk to anyone yet. Wasn't ready to put words to what had just happened, because once you start talking about it, it becomes real. And I wasn't quite ready for this to be real yet. So I finished my scotch, grabbed a blanket from the hall closet, and made myself as comfortable as possible on the $8,000 Italian leather sofa that was apparently my new bed. Above me, the house settled into silence, but I could still hear the occasional creak of floorboards and the soft murmur of voices. My wife and her strategic partner, planning their future in the bed I'd bought for our marriage. Tomorrow, I'd have to figure out what came next. Tomorrow, I'd have to start untangling 7 years of shared finances and broken promises. Tomorrow, I'd have to decide whether to fight for something that was already dead or walk away from the wreckage with whatever dignity I had left. But tonight, I just lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling of my own home, feeling like a stranger in my own life. You ever wake up on a leather couch that costs more than most people's cars and realize your life has become a really expensive episode of Jerry Springer? Yeah, welcome to my Wednesday morning. My neck felt like I'd been in a cage fight with a chiropractor, and there was a coffee ring stain on my shirt from where I'd apparently used my chest as a coaster sometime during my 3 hours of intermittent unconsciousness. The morning light streaming through our, Sophia's, floor-to-ceiling windows felt like someone was stabbing my eyeballs with tiny diamond daggers. But you know what? I'd slept worse in 5-star hotels. I could hear movement upstairs, the kind of domestic symphony that used to make me smile. Shower running, hair dryer humming, the soft padding of bare feet on hardwood. Except now it felt like listening to burglars ransack your house while you hid in the basement. My phone had apparently given birth to notifications overnight. 17 missed calls, 43 text messages, and enough email alerts to crash a small server. The entertainment blogs had been busy little bees, crafting headlines that made me sound like either a saint or a complete doormat, depending on your perspective on modern masculinity. Tech magnate's gracious response to wife's pregnancy announcement goes viral. Gracious, right? Because standing there like a deer in headlights while your marriage exploded in real time was apparently the new model of evolved masculinity. I scrolled through the messages while brewing coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Most were from reporters fishing for quotes, a few from investors probably wondering if Rosewood Tech was still a solid bet now that the founder was publicly airing her reproductive choices, and one from my lawyer that just said call me now. But I wasn't ready for damage control yet. I had bigger fish to fry. See, I'd made a decision sometime between my second scotch and my 3rd hour of staring at the ceiling. I was done being the supporting character in my own life. Done being the mysterious money man behind the brilliant female CEO. Done pretending that love was enough to sustain a partnership where only one person was actually partnering. I showered in the guest bathroom, because apparently the master suite was now occupied territory, and put on my best suit. The charcoal Armani that made me look like I could buy and sell small countries, which, let's be honest, wasn't entirely inaccurate. If I was going to have a confrontation, I was going to look like a man who had options. The drive to Rosewood Tech felt like driving to my own funeral. Our building, another thing I'd technically paid for, gleamed in the morning sun like a monument to ambition and poor judgment. The parking garage was fuller than usual, probably because half the tech press was camped out in our lobby hoping to catch a glimpse of the aftermath. I took the elevator straight to the executive floor, nodding at security guards who'd seen me coming and going for 7 years. They looked at me with that particular mixture of pity and curiosity that people reserve for public figures who've been publicly humiliated. Like I was a zoo animal who'd learned to wear a tie. Sophia's office door was open, and I could hear voices inside. Her laugh, that same bright, confident sound that used to make my chest warm but now made my teeth ache. And Brian's deeper chuckle, the sound of a man who thought he'd won the lottery and couldn't quite believe his luck. I walked in without knocking because, frankly, I was past the point of observing social niceties. They were wrapped around each other like teenagers at a school dance, her arms around his neck, while he whispered something in her ear that was making her giggle. Professional as hell, really. Nothing says serious business partnership like making out in the corner office before 9 a.m. Morning, I said, and they sprang apart like I'd walked in on them robbing a bank. Sophia smoothed her skirt and tried to regain that CEO composure, but her lipstick was smudged and Brian's tie was crooked. Real subtle, guys. Oh, good. You're here. she said, like she'd been expecting me to show up for my own professional execution. We need to talk about some organizational changes. Organizational changes. I had to admire the corporate speak. Most wives just said, I want a divorce. Sophia was restructuring our entire relationship like a hostile takeover. I figured, I said, settling into the leather chair across from her desk. The same chair where I'd sat through countless strategy sessions, budget meetings, and late-night planning conversations that had built this company from a pipe dream into a publicly traded enterprise. Brian perched on the edge of her desk like he owned the place, which I guess he thought he did now. Look, man, nothing personal, but with the IPO and everything, we need to streamline operations. Nothing personal. The guy who knocked up my wife was telling me that my professional demotion was nothing personal. Brian's going to be taking over as general manager, Sophia announced, her voice all business except for the slight flush in her cheeks. You'll be reporting to him as deputy manager. It makes sense from a strategic standpoint. Strategic standpoint. Right. Because sleeping with the boss was definitely a core competency that belonged on a resume. I looked around the office, at the awards on the walls that celebrated achievements I'd architected, at the photos of company milestones I'd financed, at the strategic planning whiteboard that still had my handwriting all over it. 7 years of my life, distilled into a deputy manager position under a guy who probably couldn't spell strategic without autocorrect. That's an interesting proposal, I said, reaching into my jacket pocket. But I have a counteroffer. I pulled out the resignation letter I'd been carrying around for 3 months like a get-out-of-jail-free card. Some paranoid part of my brain had apparently seen this coming long before my conscious mind was ready to admit it. The letter was crisp, professional, and brutal in its brevity. Ms. Rosewood, I said, placing it on her desk with the kind of formality that made her flinch. Not Sophia, not honey or sweetheart, or any of the pet names I'd used for 7 years. Ms. Rosewood, I believe this will resolve any concerns about organizational structure. Her face went pale. You can't be serious. Dead serious. I stood up, straightening my tie. Effective immediately. Brian was reading over her shoulder, and I watched his smug expression shift into something approaching panic. Wait, hold up. You can't just. We need, the transition period. What transition period? I asked. You seem to have everything well in hand. Strategic partnership and all that. The office door opened, and Sophia's secretary Angela poked her head in. Ms. Rosewood? The gentleman from New York is here for the 10 o'clock. Sophia looked confused. What gentleman from New York? The investment representative, Angela said, checking her tablet. For the final IPO documentation review. And that's when I remembered the most beautiful detail of all. The one thing that Brian's strategic brilliance and Sophia's corporate restructuring hadn't accounted for. The New York investment group wasn't just buying into Rosewood Tech. They were buying into Rosewood Tech with the express understanding that I came with the package. Not because they particularly cared about my charming personality, but because they'd done their due diligence and realized that every major decision, every successful product launch, every profitable quarter could be traced back to strategies and connections that had my fingerprints all over them. Send him in, I said, settling back into my chair with the first genuine smile I'd worn in 24 hours. The representative walked in 30 seconds later, a sharp-dressed man in his 50s with the kind of confidence that comes from moving serious money around serious markets. His eyes swept the room, taking in the cozy tableau of Sophia, Brian, and their obvious discomfort. Mr. Vance, he said, extending his hand to me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Glad to see you're here. We need to discuss some concerns that have come up overnight. Concerns? Sophia's voice cracked slightly. He turned to her with the kind of polite indifference reserved for people who were about to become irrelevant. Yes, Ms. Rosewood. Our analysis indicates that Mr. Vance's departure would fundamentally alter the risk profile of this investment. Without his continued involvement, I'm afraid we'll have to reconsider the entire deal. The silence in the room was so complete I could hear the air conditioning humming. I'm sorry, Brian stammered, but surely the management transition we discussed won't matter. The representative cut him off smoothly. Our investors aren't funding a company. They're funding a track record. And that track record walks out the door with Mr. Vance. I stood up, picked up my resignation letter from Sophia's desk, and folded it neatly before slipping it back into my jacket pocket. "Gentlemen, ladies," I said, nodding to each of them in turn. "It's been educational." And then I walked out, leaving behind 7 years of building someone else's dream, carrying nothing but a cardboard box of personal items and the most liberating feeling I'd had since I was 25 years old. Behind me, I could hear Sophia calling my name, but I didn't look back. Some bridges are meant to be burned. You know what's weird about driving to your childhood home after your adult life just imploded? The muscle memory kicks in before your brain catches up. I found myself taking the scenic route through Westchester without even thinking about it, past the country club where I'd learned to play tennis badly, and the prep school where I'd learned that having money doesn't automatically make you popular. The Vance estate sat behind iron gates that had been intimidating visitors since 1847, when my great-great-grandfather decided that subtlety was for people who couldn't afford to be obvious. 37 acres of perfectly manicured lawns, gardens that required a full-time staff of 6, and a main house that looked like it had been designed by someone who thought Downton Abbey needed more marble and fewer servants with opinions. I'd grown up thinking this place was normal. Took me until college to realize that most families don't have a separate building just for storing cars, or that summer kitchen isn't a universal concept. The gates swung open before I even pressed the call button. Dad's security team had probably spotted my car from half a mile away. Old habits from his days in international finance, when knowing who was coming up your driveway could mean the difference between a pleasant evening and a very unpleasant kidnapping attempt. Charles Vance was waiting for me on the front steps, and seeing him there felt like stepping back in time. He looked exactly the same as he had when I was 12 and thought he was the most powerful man in the world. Silver hair perfectly styled, posture that could make a West Point cadet weep with envy, and eyes that had seen enough corporate warfare to recognize a casualty from 3 zip codes away. "Son," he said, and that one word carried about 17 different layers of meaning. Sympathy, disappointment, understanding, and just a hint of "I told you so" wrapped up in 2 syllables. "Dad." I climbed the steps feeling like I was about to get called into the principal's office, except the principal was wearing a $1,000 suit and owned half of Lower Manhattan. He didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations, didn't launch into one of his lectures about due diligence and risk assessment. He just put his hand on my shoulder and steered me inside, past the oil paintings of dead relatives who'd probably handled their personal disasters with more dignity than I was currently managing. We ended up in his study, which looked exactly like Central Casting's idea of where rich old men go to drink expensive whiskey and make decisions that affect entire industries. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined with first editions, a massive oak desk that had allegedly belonged to some railroad baron, and windows that looked out over gardens that cost more to maintain than most people's annual salaries. Dad poured 2 glasses of something that was probably older than I was and settled into his leather chair with the kind of grace that comes from decades of practice at looking completely in control even when everything is going to hell. "So," he said, swirling his whiskey like he was contemplating the mysteries of the universe. "Want to tell me about it? Or should I just read the Wall Street Journal tomorrow and piece it together myself?" I took a gulp of whiskey that probably cost more than most people's car payments and tried to figure out where to start. "Sophia's pregnant. Congratulations." His tone was perfectly neutral, which meant he'd already heard about last night's announcement and was waiting for the other shoe to drop. "It's not mine." "Oh." He nodded like I'd just confirmed something he'd already suspected. "The Carter boy." Of course he knew about Brian. Charles Vance didn't just read the financial pages. He had people whose job it was to know things about people who might matter someday. Brian Carter had probably been in a file somewhere since the day he first showed up at a Rosewood Tech Board meeting. "She announced it at the IPO launch," I continued, "in front of 300 people and half the tech press." Dad's eyebrows rose slightly, which for him was the equivalent of jumping up and down screaming. "That seems strategically questionable." "You think?" I laughed, but it came out more bitter than amused. "Then this morning she tried to demote me, make me Brian's deputy, and I quit." "Good." He leaned back in his chair, looking satisfied. "What else?" I stared at him. "What else?" "Dad, my wife just publicly humiliated me, my company just imploded, and my entire life is about to become tabloid fodder. What else could there possibly be?" He stood up and walked to his desk, opening the bottom drawer to pull out a thick manila folder that looked like it had been waiting for this exact moment. This. I opened it, and my blood pressure spiked about 40 points. Financial records, email printouts, legal documents, and what looked like enough evidence to put half of Rosewood Tech's executive team behind bars for the next decade. What the hell is this? Your exit file, he said calmly. I've been having it compiled for the past 18 months. I flipped through pages of documented financial irregularities, unpaid tax obligations, and accounting practices that were creative enough to win awards if fraud was an Olympic sport. How did you, when did you? Son, you've been talking about that company at every family dinner for 7 years. You think I wasn't paying attention? He settled back into his chair, looking like a professor who was finally getting to teach his favorite lesson. Every time you mentioned some questionable decision Sophia made, every time you complained about corners being cut or regulations being bent, I had my people look into it. There were emails in here from Sophia to Brian that dated back over a year, long before their strategic partnership had gone public. Communications about moving money through offshore accounts, discussions about creative tax strategies that were definitely not IRS approved, and enough evidence of deliberate financial misconduct to keep a team of federal prosecutors busy for months. Dad, this is... I held up a document that showed Brian siphoning money from client accounts to fund his own lifestyle. This is criminal. Yes, it is. His voice was matter-of-fact, like we were discussing the weather. Your wife has been running a very sophisticated operation, using your reputation and family connections to legitimize what is essentially a high-end Ponzi scheme. The room felt like it was tilting sideways. You've known about this for 18 months? I've suspected it for longer. He leaned forward, his expression serious. But I needed proof, and I needed you to see it for yourself. If I'd come to you 2 years ago with accusations about Sophia, what would you have done? I thought about it honestly. I would have defended her. Exactly. Love makes us stupid, son. It makes us ignore red flags, rationalize bad behavior, and enable people who are actively destroying us. He gestured to the folder. But now you've seen what she's really capable of. Now you understand that this was never about business disagreements or strategic differences. This was about a predator who identified a target and spent 7 years systematically destroying him. I was quiet for a long time, reading through document after document that painted a picture of deliberate, calculated betrayal. Not just the affair, that was almost secondary. This was financial fraud on a scale that could have destroyed not just me, but my entire family's reputation. Why didn't you stop me? I asked finally. Because you're a grown man, and sometimes grown men need to make their own mistakes. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the gardens where I'd played as a kid, back when the world seemed simpler and people were either good or bad with no gray areas in between. But also because I knew you'd figure it out eventually. You're a Vance. We don't stay victims for long. So what now? He turned back to me with a smile that would have made his enemies very nervous back in his corporate raider days. Now we play the game by rules that actually matter. Not love, not loyalty, not trust. Those are luxuries for people who can afford to be naive. We play by the rules of power, money, and consequences. He handed me another folder, this one thinner, but somehow more substantial. Your mother always said that love wasn't a business model. She was right. But business? Business is definitely a model for dealing with people who mistake kindness for weakness. I opened the second folder and found legal documents that were already prepared, financial strategies that were already in motion, and a plan that was so thorough it took my breath away. Dad, this is justice, he said simply. Or revenge, depending on how you want to look at it. The beautiful thing about having resources is that you get to choose which battles to fight and how to fight them. Sophia chose to make this personal. Now it becomes business. I closed the folder and looked at my father, really looked at him, for the first time in years. Not as the distant, intimidating figure from my childhood, but as a man who'd spent decades navigating waters that could drown people who weren't strong enough to swim. You've been planning this the whole time. I've been preparing for this possibility, he corrected. There's a difference. Hope for the best, prepare for the worst, and never let anyone mistake your generosity for stupidity. For the first time in 48 hours, I felt like I could breathe properly. Not because the situation was resolved, it was still a complete disaster, but because I finally understood that I wasn't facing it alone. So what's the first move? His smile got wider. We let them think they've won. And then we show them what losing actually looks like. Outside the windows, the sun was setting over the estate where 5 generations of Vances had learned that sometimes the most important lessons come disguised as the worst days of your life. I was finally ready to graduate. You know what they say about revenge being a dish best served cold? Turns out it's even better when it arrives via certified mail at 6 in the morning with a side of federal marshals. I was nursing my first cup of coffee in Dad's kitchen, because apparently I lived at the family estate now, which felt both like a step backward and a strategic retreat, when my phone started buzzing like an angry wasp. Sarah, my former assistant who'd somehow managed to stay neutral in the divorce proceedings that weren't technically divorce proceedings yet. They're freaking out, she said without preamble. Sophia's been calling every lawyer in Manhattan, and Brian locked himself in his office and won't come out. Good morning to you too, Sarah. I settled into one of the breakfast nook chairs that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. What exactly are they freaking out about? You haven't seen the news? I hadn't seen much of anything except the inside of a whiskey glass and my father's legal documents for the past 18 hours. Enlighten me. Federal investigators raided Rosewood Tech this morning. Something about financial irregularities and tax evasion. The entire building is crawling with FBI agents. I nearly choked on my coffee. Dad worked fast when he wanted to. Is that so? Don't play dumb with me, Sarah said, but there was amusement in her voice. I've been fielding calls from reporters all morning asking for comment about your mysterious departure and whether you had advanced knowledge of any improprieties. Want to tell me what you know that I don't? I know that karma has excellent timing, I said, and that you should probably update your resume. Already done, along with about half the staff who aren't currently being questioned by federal agents. After Sarah hung up, I wandered into Dad's study to find him reading the Wall Street Journal with the satisfied expression of someone whose chess moves were finally paying off. The headline on the front page made me smile for the first time in 3 days. Rosewood Tech under federal investigation following anonymous whistleblower report. Anonymous, I said, settling into the chair across from his desk. Completely anonymous. He agreed without looking up from his paper. Some concerned citizen with an extensive knowledge of financial fraud and a civic duty to report it. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Asterisk, this is Assistant District Attorney Marisol Navarro. I'd like to speak with you about Rosewood Tech at your earliest convenience. Asterisk. I showed Dad the message. He nodded approvingly. Excellent. Marisol's one of the best prosecutors in the Southern District. She doesn't waste time on cases she can't win. Should I be worried about being implicated in any of this? Son, you documented every questionable decision Sophia made for 7 years. Your email trail reads like a compliance officer's wet dream. Constant warnings about regulatory issues. Repeated requests for proper documentation, and a paper trail showing that you tried to keep that company on the right side of the law. He folded his newspaper with military precision. You're not a co-conspirator. You're their star witness. An hour later, I was sitting in a conference room at the U.S. Attorney's office, staring across a polished table at a woman who looked like she could prosecute war criminals before lunch and still have time for a manicure. Marisol Navarro was in her 40s, with the kind of sharp intelligence that made you want to check your math twice and the bearing of someone who'd never met a white-collar criminal she couldn't convict. Mr. Vance, she said, opening a folder that was disappointingly thin compared to Dad's comprehensive dossier. Thank you for coming in voluntarily. Thank you for not arresting me. I replied, which earned me a small smile. We're not interested in arresting you. We're interested in what you know about Rosewood Tech's financial practices. She leaned back in her chair, studying me like I was a puzzle she was trying to solve. Particularly anything involving offshore accounts, unreported income, or fraudulent investor statements. For the next 2 hours, I walked her through 7 years of questionable decisions, creative accounting, and outright fraud that I'd been documenting without even realizing it. Every email I'd sent questioning expenses, every memo I'd written about compliance issues, every budget meeting where I'd raised red flags about Sophia's aggressive growth strategies. You kept very detailed records, Marisol observed, flipping through printouts of emails that painted a picture of systematic financial misconduct. I'm thorough, I said. Comes from growing up in a family where accountability actually matters. And yet you continued to work there, continued to finance the operation, even when you suspected illegal activity. That was the million-dollar question, wasn't it? I thought I was protecting her. I thought if I could just guide her toward better practices, keep her from making mistakes that would destroy everything she'd worked for. I shrugged. Turns out I was just enabling her. Marisol made a note. When did you first become aware of Mr. Carter's involvement? About 6 months ago, he started showing up at board meetings, offering strategic guidance that usually involved finding new ways to move money around. I raised concerns about his background, his qualifications, his apparent lack of any actual business plan beyond spending our investors' money. And Ms. Rosewood's response? She told me I was being paranoid and possessive. That Brian brought valuable outside perspective, and I needed to trust her judgment. Another note. Did you have any knowledge of their personal relationship? I thought about the pregnancy test, the late nights, the way Sophia's behavior had changed over the past year. I suspected something was going on, but I didn't have proof until she announced it at the IPO launch. In front of 300 witnesses and multiple news outlets. Sophia always did like dramatic reveals. That earned me another small smile. Mr. Vance, based on what you've told me today and the documentation you've provided, I believe we have enough evidence to pursue charges of securities fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy. Are you prepared to testify if this goes to trial? Absolutely. She closed her folder and leaned forward. I have to ask, the timing of your resignation, coming just before this investigation became public, might look suspicious to some people. Some people might think a lot of things, I said, but the evidence speaks for itself. I tried to keep that company honest for 7 years. When it became clear that wasn't possible, I got out before I became complicit. And the anonymous tip that triggered this investigation? I met her eyes steadily. I wouldn't know anything about that. But whoever provided it did their civic duty. 3 hours later, I was back at the estate, watching the news coverage on Dad's massive television while he made phone calls to people whose names I recognized from Forbes lists. The Rosewood tech story was leading every business broadcast, complete with footage of FBI agents carrying boxes of documents out of the building I'd walked out of less than 48 hours earlier. My phone had been buzzing constantly with calls from reporters, but the only one I answered was from Marcus Webb at TechCrunch. Jesus Christ, man, he said without preamble. Did you know this was coming when you quit? I knew Sophia was making decisions that couldn't end well, I said carefully. I just didn't know how bad it was until I was out of the situation and could see it objectively. So the resignation was me finally admitting that you can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. And now, I looked out the window at the gardens where I'd played as a child, before I'd learned that the world was full of people who would smile at you while picking your pocket. Now I'm focused on moving forward. Sometimes you have to let the past burn before you can build something better. After Marcus hung up, Dad appeared in the doorway with 2 glasses of champagne. Celebrating already? I asked. Not celebrating, he said, handing me a glass. Acknowledging. You spent 7 years trying to be the man you thought she needed you to be. Today, you started being the man you actually are. And what kind of man is that? He smiled, and for the first time in years, I saw pride in his eyes. A Vance. Outside, the sun was setting over Westchester, painting the sky the color of expensive wine and new beginnings. Tomorrow, Sophia and Brian would have to face the consequences of their choices. Tonight, I could finally sleep knowing that justice wasn't just coming. It had arrived with a warrant and a badge. Some people learn the hard way that actions have consequences. Others learn that patience and preparation beat passion and betrayal every single time. I was finally ready to stop being someone else's victim and start being my own man. You know what's funny about federal investigations? They make people very chatty. Suddenly, everyone wants to have conversations they've been avoiding for months. Usually right around the time the FBI starts asking uncomfortable questions about offshore banking and creative bookkeeping. I was 3 days into my new routine of living at Dad's estate and pretending to read financial newspapers while actually binge-watching true crime documentaries when Sophia called. Not texted, called. Which meant she was either desperate or completely delusional, possibly both. We need to talk, she said without preamble, her voice carrying that brittle quality that meant she was barely holding it together. I think we've talked enough, I replied, pausing Netflix mid-episode. Some documentary about Ponzi schemes that was hitting a little too close to home. It's about the baby. Of course it was. Because apparently my life had become one of those soap operas where paternity tests and federal investigations happen in the same week. What about the baby? Last I heard, Brian was the proud papa-to-be. There was a long silence, the kind that usually precedes really bad news or really desperate lies. With Sophia, it was often hard to tell the difference. "I need to see you," she said finally. "In person. There are things we need to discuss." "Sophia, if you're looking for a character witness for your upcoming trial, I'm probably not your best bet. Please." The word came out cracked, like she'd had to force it through her teeth. "One conversation. That's all I'm asking." Against my better judgment, which, let's be honest, had been making questionable decisions where Sophia was concerned for 7 years, I agreed to meet her at the little cafe in Cold Spring where we used to go on weekend mornings back, when we still pretended to be happily married. She was already there when I arrived, hunched over a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold an hour ago. She looked like hell, which was simultaneously satisfying and concerning. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, her designer clothes were wrinkled, and she had the kind of dark circles under her eyes that come from not sleeping for days. "Thanks for coming," she said as I sat down across from her. "You said it was about the baby. Talk." She fidgeted with her coffee cup, avoiding eye contact like a teenager who'd been caught sneaking out. "The timing is complicated." "Complicated how?" "I've been thinking about when it might have happened. And the dates are." She finally looked up at me, and I saw something I'd never seen before in Sophia's eyes: genuine fear. "It's possible that the baby isn't Brian's." I felt like someone had just sucker-punched me in the solar plexus. "Possible. The timeline is messy. There were a few weeks where Brian and I were taking a break. And you and I." She trailed off, but I knew what she meant. There had been a brief period about 4 months ago when we'd actually acted like a married couple again. A long weekend in the Hamptons where she'd put away her phone and we'd pretended that our marriage wasn't circling the drain. "So what are you saying exactly?" "I'm saying maybe I made a mistake. Maybe I jumped to conclusions about the paternity because I wanted it to be Brian's." She leaned forward, reaching across the table like she was going to touch my hand, then thought better of it. "Maybe this baby is yours." "Maybe." I let the word hang in the air between us. "That's a hell of a thing to be unsure about, Sophia." "I know how this sounds." "Do you?" "Because it sounds like you're trying to hedge your bets. Brian's looking at federal charges, your company is imploding, and suddenly you're not so sure about paternity. Convenient timing." Her face flushed. "That's not what this is about." "Isn't it?" "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're trying to figure out which life raft is less likely to sink." "I deserve that," she said quietly. "I deserve all of it. But the baby doesn't deserve to grow up not knowing who their real father is." That stopped me cold. Because as much as I wanted to write this off as another one of Sophia's manipulations, she had a point. If there was even a chance that this child was mine, "What do you want from me?" I asked. "A test. A paternity test. I need to know for sure, and so do you." I studied her face, looking for the tells I'd learned to recognize over 7 years of marriage. The slight twitch at the corner of her mouth when she was lying, the way her eyes would dart to the left when she was omitting important details. But all I saw was exhaustion and what looked like genuine regret. "And if the baby is mine, then we figure out how to do this right, for the child's sake. And if it's Brian's?" She was quiet for a long moment. "Then I guess I live with the choices I made." I pulled out my phone and called my lawyer, not the family attorney who handled corporate stuff, but the guy Dad had recommended for personal matters that require discretion. 20 minutes later, I had the name of a lab that could handle paternity testing with the kind of confidentiality that came with premium pricing. "We can do this through attorneys," I said. "Keep it clean, keep it legal, keep it private until we know for sure." She nodded, looking like she was about to cry. "Thank you. I'm not doing this for you," I said, standing up to leave. "I'm doing it for a child who didn't ask to be born into this mess." The test took 3 days to process, 3 days during which I alternated between hoping the baby was mine and hoping it wasn't. If it was mine, I'd have a connection to Sophia for the rest of my life. But I'd also have a child, something I'd wanted for years but had given up hope of having. If it wasn't mine, I could cut ties completely and move on with whatever was left of my life. The results came back on a Friday morning. 99.9% probability of paternity. I stared at the paper for a solid 5 minutes, reading the same numbers over and over like they might change if I looked at them hard enough. I was going to be a father. In about 5 months, there was going to be a tiny human in this world who was half me, half the woman who'd spent the last year systematically destroying my life. I called Dad first. "Congratulations, son," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "How do you feel?" "Terrified, excited, confused, all at the same time." "Sounds about right. That's what good fathers feel like before they meet their children." "What if I screw this up?" "You won't. You're a Vance. We don't do anything halfway, including parenthood." Then I called my lawyer and told him to draft custody agreements that would protect both me and the child from whatever legal fallout was coming for Sophia. Generous financial support, joint custody with primary residence to be determined based on circumstances, and ironclad protections to ensure that my child wouldn't be used as a pawn in whatever game Sophia was still trying to play. Finally, I called Sophia. "It's yours," I said without preamble. She was quiet for so long I thought she might have hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry. For all of it. For the lies, for the betrayal, for putting you through this." "Save the apologies," I said, but without the venom I'd been carrying for the past week. "We have bigger things to worry about now, like figuring out how to be parents when we can barely be civil to each other." "I want to try," she said. "To do better. To be better. For the baby. We'll see. Right now, I'm setting up legal protections for the child. Financial support, custody arrangements, everything that needs to be in place before." I paused, not wanting to say "before you go to prison" out loud. "I understand. Do you? Because this changes nothing between us, Sophia. I'm not coming back. I'm not forgetting what you did, and I'm sure as hell not playing happy family. But I will be a father to my child. That's all I can ask for." After I hung up, I sat in Dad's study, staring out at the gardens where I'd played as a kid, trying to imagine a miniature version of myself running around those same paths. It was terrifying and wonderful and completely overwhelming all at once. Dad appeared in the doorway with 2 glasses of scotch, even though it was barely noon. "To the next generation of Vances," he said, raising his glass. "To doing better than the previous generation," I replied. "We drank to that, to new beginnings and old mistakes, to the complicated truth that sometimes the worst moments of your life can lead to the best things that will ever happen to you." In 5 months, I was going to be somebody's dad. Everything else, the betrayal, the fraud, the federal investigation, suddenly seemed like background noise compared to that simple, terrifying, beautiful fact. Some lessons you learn the hard way, others you get to teach. You know what's beautiful about watching something you built burn down? When it's burning because of someone else's matches, you get to enjoy the show without feeling guilty about the ashes. The first domino fell on a Tuesday morning when Hartford Financial, our biggest client, issued a public statement terminating their contract with Rosewood Tech, effective immediately due to ongoing regulatory concerns. By lunch, 3 more clients had jumped ship. By dinner, our stock price had dropped 40% and trading had been suspended. I watched it all unfold from Dad's study, surrounded by newspapers, financial websites, and cable news channels that were treating Rosewood's collapse like the business equivalent of a natural disaster. Which, I suppose, it was. If natural disasters were caused by greed, stupidity, and a complete disregard for basic accounting principles. Rosewood Tech shares plummeted again today, following revelations of extensive financial irregularities, the CNBC anchor announced with the kind of professional gravity usually reserved for war zones and celebrity deaths. The company's CFO resigned this morning, citing irreconcilable differences with management's strategic direction, while sources close to the investigation suggest that federal prosecutors are preparing additional charges. Dad muted the television and looked at me over his reading glasses. "How are you feeling about all this?" "Honestly, like I dodged a bullet the size of a freight train." "Good. That means you're learning." My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, who'd officially joined the exodus from Rosewood last week. Brian just called an all-hands meeting. Word is they're laying off 60% of staff effective Friday. Also, someone toilet papered his car in the parking lot. I couldn't help but laugh. Brian Carter, strategic genius and master of business innovation, getting his BMW decorated with Charmin by disgruntled employees. There was something poetic about it. The real entertainment came that evening when Brian held his first, and what would turn out to be his last, press conference as acting CEO. I watched it live on YouTube because sometimes you need to see a train wreck in real time to fully appreciate the engineering failure. He stood behind a podium in what used to be our main conference room, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most of his remaining employees made in a month, trying to project confidence while his voice cracked like a 13-year-old asking someone to prom. These allegations are completely unfounded. He declared to a room full of reporters who looked like sharks that had just smelled blood in the water. Rosewood Tech has always maintained the highest standards of financial transparency and regulatory compliance. Someone in the back row raised their hand. Mr. Carter, how do you respond to reports that the FBI seized over $3 million from offshore accounts allegedly controlled by you personally? Brian's face went through about 6 different shades of red before settling on a color that reminded me of overcooked lobster. Those reports are inaccurate, and we'll be addressing them through our legal team. What legal team? Another reporter asked. Your general counsel resigned yesterday. We're in the process of securing new representation. It went downhill from there. Questions about missing investor funds, forged compliance documents, and why the company's 2 most qualified executives, meaning me and our former VP of operations, had both quit within days of each other. Brian stammered through non-answers that made him sound like a politician caught with his pants down and his hand in the cookie jar. The best part came when someone asked about Sophia. Ms. Rosewood is currently focused on her health and preparing for the arrival of her child, Brian said, like pregnancy was some kind of diplomatic immunity from federal fraud charges. Is it true that she's been offered a plea deal in exchange for testimony against co-conspirators? Brian's face went completely white. I wouldn't know anything about that. But I would, because Marisol had called me that afternoon to give me a heads up. Sophia was apparently very interested in cooperating with federal investigators in exchange for reduced charges and the possibility of house arrest instead of actual prison time. Motherhood, it seemed, had given her a sudden appreciation for accountability. She's claiming that Mr. Carter was the mastermind behind the financial irregularities, Marisol had told me. Says she was manipulated and misled about the extent of the illegal activities. And you believe her? I believe she's trying to save herself. Whether that involves throwing everyone else under the bus remains to be seen. The press conference ended with Brian essentially fleeing the podium after a reporter asked if it was true that he'd been using company funds to pay for his Manhattan penthouse and his collection of vintage sports cars. The live stream cut to a technical difficulties screen, which was probably the most honest thing Rosewood Tech had broadcast in months. Within hours, the video had gone viral. Hashtag Rosewood Meltdown was trending on Twitter, with people posting memes about Brian's deer-in-the-headlights expression and remix videos of his stammering non-answers set to dramatic music. My personal favorite was someone who'd edited his "We maintain the highest standards" line over footage of the Hindenburg disaster. By the end of the week, it was over. The State Labor Department had launched an investigation into unpaid wages. The IRS had seized the company's remaining assets. 3 separate class action lawsuits had been filed by investors who were just now realizing they'd been funding what amounted to Brian and Sophia's very expensive lifestyle instead of actual business operations. I drove past the Rosewood building on Friday evening, partly out of morbid curiosity and partly because I wanted to see the end of an era with my own eyes. The parking lot that used to be full of expensive cars and ambitious young professionals was nearly empty. Someone had taped a handwritten "For Lease" sign to the front window, and there were moving trucks parked outside loading up the few pieces of equipment that weren't being held as evidence. Maya Chun, our former lead engineer who'd quit 3 months ago because she was tired of Brian's visionary leadership, was standing by her car, loading a box of personal items. She saw me and waved. Well, she said, walking over. If it isn't the guy who got out while the getting was good. Maya, how are you holding up? Better than most. I saw this coming back when Brian started talking about innovative revenue streams that nobody could quite explain. She gestured toward the building. What about you? Any regrets? I thought about it for a moment. 7 years of my life, hundreds of hours of work, millions of dollars in investments. all of it reduced to a for lease sign and some viral videos. No, I said, and I meant it. No regrets. Good. Because word on the street is you're starting something new. She wasn't wrong. For the past 2 weeks, I'd been quietly reaching out to former Rosewood employees, the good ones, the ones who'd left because they had integrity instead of staying because they lacked options. People like Maya, who'd built our best products before Brian decided that actual engineering was less important than marketing buzzwords. Maybe, I said. Would you be interested in hearing about it? She grinned. As long as it doesn't involve offshore banking or press conferences where the CEO looks like he's about to cry. I think I can guarantee that. We talked for another 20 minutes about the kind of company we'd want to work for, the kind of leadership that actually led instead of just taking credit, the kind of culture where people could do good work without having to constantly watch their backs for backstabbing and financial fraud. As I drove home to Dad's estate, I passed a billboard advertising the latest iPhone. There was something oddly comforting about seeing a product from a company that had been built by people who actually cared about building something lasting instead of just getting rich quick. Tomorrow, I'd start making calls. Tomorrow, I'd begin the process of building something real, something honest, something that wouldn't collapse the moment someone started asking uncomfortable questions about the math. Tonight, I poured myself a drink and watched the sun set over Westchester, thinking about second chances and new beginnings, and the strange satisfaction that comes from watching karma catch up to people who thought they were too smart to face consequences. Rosewood Tech was dead, but maybe that was exactly what needed to happen before something better could grow in its place. Some forests need to burn before new trees can take root. Some companies need to collapse before their best people can build something worth believing in. I was ready to plant some seeds. You know what nobody tells you about becoming a father? The moment they put that baby in your arms, every single thing you thought mattered suddenly becomes background noise to the sound of tiny fingers gripping your thumb like you're the most important person in the entire universe. I got the call at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in March, which seemed appropriate since nothing in my life had happened during normal business hours for the past year. Sophia's voice was tight with pain and exhaustion, but clearer than it had been in months. "It's time," she said, and I could hear hospital sounds in the background. Beeping machines, muffled conversations, the kind of controlled chaos that happens when life decides to make its entrance whether you're ready or not. I'm on my way. I'd been packed and ready for 2 weeks, keeping a bag in my car like some kind of expectant father who actually lived with his pregnant wife instead of 30 miles away at his family estate. The drive to Mount Sinai took 45 minutes through empty streets that felt like a movie set for the apocalypse. All abandoned traffic lights and 24-hour diners glowing like beacons in the darkness. Sophia was already in delivery when I arrived, surrounded by nurses who moved with the kind of practiced efficiency that comes from helping tiny humans make their grand entrance on a regular basis. She looked exhausted and terrified and absolutely beautiful in the way that only women in labor can manage, like warriors who've been fighting a battle that nobody else can see. "You made it," she said, reaching for my hand with a grip that could have crushed walnuts. Wouldn't miss it. And I meant it. Whatever had happened between us, whatever betrayals and lies and federal investigations had brought us to this moment, none of it mattered compared to the fact that our child was about to enter the world. This wasn't about Sophia and me anymore. This was about someone who deserved better than the mess we'd made of our adult lives. The next 4 hours were a blur of medical terminology, coaching sessions that made me feel completely useless, and the kind of primal fear that comes from realizing you're about to be responsible for keeping another human being alive for the next 18 years minimum. Every contraction, every monitor beep, every whispered consultation between doctors made my heart rate spike like I was running a marathon in a 3-piece suit. But then she was here. Grace Elizabeth Vance came into the world at 7:23 a.m. weighing 6 pounds, 4 ounces, with a set of lungs that could probably be heard in Connecticut and the most perfect tiny face I'd ever seen in my life. The doctor placed her on Sophia's chest, all slippery and red and absolutely furious about being evicted from her comfortable 9-month lease, and I swear to God the entire world just stopped spinning for a moment. "She's perfect," Sophia whispered, tears streaming down her face as she looked at our daughter like she'd never seen anything so miraculous. And she was perfect in the way that only brand new humans can be, before the world teaches them to be complicated and suspicious and careful with their hearts. Perfect in the way that made every mistake I'd made in my 35 years feel like small change compared to the responsibility of helping this little person figure out how to be human. When they cleaned her up and wrapped her in one of those hospital blankets that looked like they were designed by someone who'd never actually seen a baby, the nurse asked if I wanted to hold her. I'd been waiting for this moment for months, practicing with teddy bears and watching YouTube videos about proper infant holding techniques like I was studying for the most important exam of my life. But when she placed Grace in my arms, all that preparation went out the window because nothing, absolutely nothing, prepares you for the weight of your own child. She was so small, so impossibly, frighteningly small. Her entire hand could fit around my pinky finger, and when she opened her eyes and looked at me with that unfocused newborn gaze that somehow seemed to see right through to your soul, I understood for the first time in my life what people meant when they talked about love at first sight. "Hello, beautiful," I whispered, and her tiny face scrunched up like she was considering whether or not to approve of my voice. Apparently, I passed the test, because she settled against my chest with a little sigh that sounded like contentment. I named her Grace because that's what she was. Unearned mercy after a year of betrayal and disappointment. Grace because she was the good thing that had come out of the wreckage of my marriage. Grace because looking at her perfect little face made me believe in the possibility of second chances and new beginnings and love that didn't come with conditions or expiration dates. Dad arrived 2 hours later, still wearing his pajama top under his blazer, because apparently even Charles Vance could be rattled by the prospect of meeting his first grandchild. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at me holding Grace, and I saw something in his eyes that I'd been waiting my whole life to see. Pride that wasn't conditional on stock prices or business deals or living up to family expectations. "She's beautiful, son," he said, his voice softer than I'd heard it since I was a kid. "Want to hold her?" He washed his hands twice, dried them carefully, and accepted Grace like she was made of spun glass and good intentions. Watching my father, who'd negotiated billion-dollar deals and stared down corporate raiders and never shown weakness in front of anyone, go completely soft over an 8-pound baby was one of the most beautiful things I'd ever witnessed. "Hello, Grace," he murmured, and she opened her eyes like she recognized his voice from some genetic memory of Vance family gatherings. "I'm your grandfather, and I'm going to teach you how to ride horses and make smart investments and never trust anyone who can't look you in the eye." Sophia laughed from her hospital bed, the first genuinely happy sound I'd heard from her in months. "Charles, she's 6 hours old. Never too early to start learning about character," he replied, but his tone was gentle. Even he wasn't immune to the particular magic that newborns work on grown-ups who think they've seen everything. We took turns holding her, this perfect little person who'd managed to do what months of therapy and legal negotiations couldn't. Create a moment of peace between 3 adults who'd spent the better part of a year making each other miserable. Not forgiveness, exactly, because some things can't be forgiven, but a kind of truce, an agreement that whatever had happened between us was less important than making sure Grace grew up knowing she was loved. When visiting hours ended and Dad had gone home to call half of Westchester County with the news, I sat beside Sophia's bed while Grace slept in the clear plastic bassinet that all hospital babies come in. "She looks like you," Sophia said, studying our daughter's face like she was memorizing every detail. "She looks like herself," I replied. "That's all that matters." Sophia was quiet for a long moment, watching Grace's tiny chest rise and fall with the steady rhythm of sleep. "I know I don't have the right to ask this," she said finally, "but I want to try to be a good mother, to do better than I did as a wife." I looked at her, really looked at her. For the first time in months, she was pale and exhausted and facing federal charges that could send her to prison for the next decade. But she was also the mother of my child. And whatever else she was, whatever she'd done, Grace was going to need her. "Then be better," I said simply. "Not for me, not because you feel guilty, but because she deserves the best version of whoever you decide to be." That night, I slept in the uncomfortable hospital chair next to Grace's bassinet, waking up every hour to check that she was still breathing, still perfect, still the most important thing that had ever happened to me. Every time I looked at her sleeping face, I felt something I'd forgotten was possible, hope that wasn't complicated by disappointment or are tempered by experience. At 2 a.m., when the hospital was quiet except for the sound of machines and the soft footsteps of nurses making their rounds, Grace opened her eyes and looked at me with that serious expression that newborns wear when they're trying to figure out this strange new world they've landed in. "It's okay, sweetheart," I whispered, reaching through the bassinet rails to let her wrap her tiny fingers around mine. "Daddy's here. Daddy's going to make sure you're safe." And for the first time in my adult life, I made a promise that I knew I'd never break, no matter what it cost me, no matter what sacrifices it required, no matter what battles I'd have to fight. Grace was going to grow up knowing what unconditional love felt like. She was going to grow up in a world where actions had consequences, but love didn't have to be earned. She was going to grow up knowing that some things, the important things, never let you down. Some gifts come wrapped in pretty paper with ribbons and bows. Others come covered in amniotic fluid at 7 in the morning after the worst year of your life. Grace was definitely the second kind of gift, and she was perfect. You know what's funny about starting over at 35? Everyone assumes you're having a midlife crisis, right up until they see that you're actually building something that makes sense for the first time in your adult life. Harbor Technologies started in a rented office space above a Korean barbecue restaurant in Tarrytown, which seemed appropriate since my last venture had left a bad taste in everyone's mouth, and this one literally smelled like grilled meat and second chances. The space was nothing fancy. 4 rooms, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look like they had hepatitis, and a bathroom that required jiggling the handle just right or you'd be standing there all day. But it was ours. More importantly, it was honest. Maya Chun was my first hire, partly because she was brilliant and partly because she'd seen enough corporate bullshit at Rosewood to appreciate a workplace where the biggest drama was arguing over coffee brands. She showed up on our first official day with a fancy espresso machine that probably cost more than our monthly rent. "Consider it a housewarming gift," she said, setting it up in what we generously called the break room, but was really just a corner with a mini fridge and some folding chairs. "If we're going to work 18-hour days building something from scratch, we might as well have decent caffeine." Ken Rodriguez joined us 2 weeks later. He'd been Rosewood's best product manager before Brian decided that visionary leadership was more important than actually understanding what customers wanted. Ken had the rare combination of technical knowledge and common sense that made him worth his weight in equity options. "So what's the plan?" he asked during our first official team meeting, which took place around a folding table that looked like it had been rescued from a church rummage sale. "Build something people actually need," I said. "Solve real problems. Pay everyone on time. Tell the truth." Maya laughed. "Wow, revolutionary business strategy right there. You'd be surprised how revolutionary it is in this industry." We decided to focus on cybersecurity software for small businesses, the kind of companies that couldn't afford enterprise-level protection but were getting hammered by increasingly sophisticated cyber attacks. It wasn't sexy, it wasn't going to make us Silicon Valley darlings, but it was necessary, and there was a real market for it. More importantly, it was the opposite of everything Rosewood had been. No offshore accounts, no creative accounting, no promising investors' returns that defied basic mathematics. We were going to build software, sell it at a fair price, and use the profits to build better software. Radical concept, apparently. Our first product took 6 months to develop, working out of that glorified storage unit above the restaurant. Long days that stretched into longer nights, fueled by Maya's espresso machine and Ken's apparently endless supply of Korean snacks from the place downstairs. We'd take breaks by walking around the parking lot, discussing feature sets and market positioning while the smell of bulgogi drifted up from the restaurant below. It was the most fun I'd had working since my early days at Rosewood, back when Sophia still listened to my ideas and Brian Carter was just some guy we'd never heard of. There's something pure about building something from nothing, about solving problems that actually matter instead of trying to figure out how to monetize other people's data without them noticing. The first customer was a small accounting firm in White Plains that had been hit by ransomware twice in 6 months. Their old IT guy had basically shrugged and told them to pay the hackers, which seemed like a suboptimal long-term strategy. We installed our software, walked them through the features, and within 2 weeks they were sending us referrals. "This is how business is supposed to work," Ken said after our 5th customer signed on. "You build something useful, people pay you for it, everyone wins. Don't get too excited, Maya warned. We're still operating above a restaurant and using furniture that looks like it escaped from a community center. But she was smiling when she said it, and I knew she felt it too. That sense of building something real, something that would still be here in 5 years, not because we'd been clever with accounting tricks, but because we'd actually solved problems for people. The growth was organic, steady, the kind of sustainable increase that comes from word of mouth and repeat customers rather than flashy marketing campaigns and venture capital hype. By the end of our first year, we had 43 clients, 7 employees, and enough revenue to move into an actual office building with windows and a bathroom that flushed on the first try. The new space was in a converted warehouse in Sleepy Hollow, all exposed brick and high ceilings, and the kind of industrial chic that made people think we were more successful than we actually were. But it felt right, substantial without being pretentious, professional without being corporate in the soul-crushing way that makes people dread Monday mornings. "This is nice," Dad said when he came by for the unofficial grand opening. "Feels like a place where people actually work instead of just having meetings about meetings." He was right. Harbor had become the kind of company where people stayed late because they wanted to finish something, not because some manager was keeping score of FaceTime. The kind of place where problems got solved with engineering instead of politics, where good ideas came from anyone smart enough to have them. We instituted 3 rules, printed them on a sign by the front door: pay on time, tell the truth, go home. Simple enough that everyone could remember them, important enough that they actually mattered. The media attention started about 18 months in, when some business reporter noticed that several former Rosewood employees had ended up at the same company and were actually successful instead of bitter and unemployed. The articles were generally positive, though they all seemed to focus more on the drama of my previous situation than on what we were actually building. Tech Heir builds new empire from ashes of marriage scandal. Read one headline that made me want to throw my laptop out the window. Ignore it, Maya advised. Let them write their soap opera stories. Our customers don't care about your personal life. They care about whether our software keeps their data safe. She was right, but it was still annoying. Every interview request, every profile piece, every business podcast invitation came with the same underlying assumption that Harbor was somehow about revenge or redemption or proving something to my ex-wife. As if building a successful company wasn't reason enough in itself. The truth was simpler and less dramatic than the stories people wanted to tell. Sophia had made her choices, the legal system was dealing with the consequences, and I was focused on raising my daughter and building something that would still matter when she was old enough to ask what her father did for a living. Speaking of Grace, she was 18 months old now and had started making appearances at the office, usually strapped to my chest in one of those baby carriers that made me look like I was smuggling a very small, very cute nuclear device. The team treated her like a mascot, and she seemed to enjoy the attention, babbling at people during meetings and generally charming everyone into believing that babies belonged in professional environments. "She's going to grow up thinking all offices have slides and juice boxes," Ken observed after Grace had spent an afternoon crawling around our conference room while we worked on a presentation. "There are worse things to believe," I replied. The first time a reporter asked me about Rosewood directly, I gave them the same answer I'd been giving everyone. I'm focused on moving forward. Harbor is about building solutions, not relitigating the past. It became my standard line, repeated so often that Maya started timing how long it took journalists to ask the question. Her current record was 47 seconds from hello to "so tell me about your former company." But the truth was, I rarely thought about Rosewood anymore except when people brought it up. Sophia was facing trial in 6 months. Brian had disappeared into whatever hole people crawl into when their lives become cautionary tales, and the company that had once been my whole world was now just a line item in federal court documents. Harbor, on the other hand, was growing. Real growth, sustainable growth, the kind that came from solving actual problems instead of creating elaborate financial instruments that nobody really understood. We were profitable, our employees were happy, and our customers were sending us thank you emails instead of subpoenas. Some days, working late in our warehouse office with Grace asleep in her portable crib and the team debugging code that would protect small businesses from cyber criminals, I felt like I'd finally figured out what I was supposed to be doing with my life. Not performing, not proving anything, just building something useful with people I respected and going home at the end of the day knowing that the work mattered. It had taken 35 years and a very public personal disaster, but I'd finally learned the difference between success and achievement, between being important and doing important work. Harbor wasn't just my second act. It was my first honest one. You know what's funny about finding peace? It doesn't announce itself with fireworks or champagne toasts. It just shows up one evening when you're sitting on your father's porch, holding your 2-year-old daughter while fireflies blink like tiny Christmas lights across the lawn, and you realize that for the first time in your adult life, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Grace had fallen asleep against my chest after an epic battle with bedtime that involved 3 stories, 2 songs, and one very serious negotiation about whether stuffed elephants needed to brush their teeth. She was getting heavier, all chubby legs and wild curls that smelled like baby shampoo, and the particular sweetness that belongs only to children who haven't learned to worry about tomorrow yet. Dad sat in the rocking chair beside me, reading glasses perched on his nose as he worked through some financial reports that probably controlled the GDP of small countries. But even he seemed more relaxed these days, less driven by the constant need to acquire and achieve that had defined most of his adult life. Maybe having a granddaughter did that to people, reminded them that some things were more important than quarterly earnings. "She's getting big," he observed, looking up from his papers. "Too big. I keep thinking she was just born yesterday, but then she does something like count to 10 or correctly identify the difference between a truck and a bulldozer, and I realize she's becoming an actual person with opinions and everything. Terrifying, isn't it? Absolutely terrifying. Best thing that ever happened to me, but terrifying." It had been 3 years since that night at the IPO announcement that changed everything. 2 years since Grace was born, and 18 months since Harbor had become profitable enough that I could stop checking our bank balance every morning like I was monitoring a patient's vital signs. Time enough for the dust to settle, for the media attention to fade, for life to find its new normal. Sophia had been sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years of house arrest and community service. She'd taken the plea deal, testified against Brian and several other co-conspirators, and generally cooperated enough that she'd avoided the 5 to 10-year sentence that had initially been on the table. She was currently serving her time at a minimum security facility in Connecticut that was probably nicer than most college dorms. Brian, on the other hand, had decided to fight the charges and was now looking at a potential 15-year sentence when his trial concluded next month. Last I'd heard, he was representing himself after burning through 3 different legal teams, which seemed like the kind of brilliant strategic decision that had gotten him into this mess in the first place. I visited Sophia once a month, bringing Grace for supervised visits in a room that smelled like industrial disinfectant and broken dreams. It was awkward at first, trying to maintain some kind of co-parenting relationship through a federal correctional facility, but we'd found our rhythm. Grace was too young to understand why Mommy lived in a place with security guards and metal detectors, but she was old enough to light up when she saw Sophia's face, and that was all that mattered. "She said Harbor yesterday," I told Dad, shifting Grace's weight as she stirred slightly in her sleep. "Clear as day. Daddy go Harbor. Smart girl. Knows where the good work happens." Harbor had grown into something I was genuinely proud of, not in the chest-thumping way that comes from beating competitors or impressing investors, but in the quiet satisfaction that comes from building something useful. We had 63 employees now, offices in 3 states, and a client list that read like a directory of American small business success stories. More importantly, we'd maintained our culture. People still stayed late because they wanted to, not because they had to. Good ideas still came from anyone smart enough to have them. And we still printed our 3 rules on business cards that we handed out at conferences. Pay on time. Tell the truth. Go home. Speaking of which, Maya had said during our last leadership meeting, "When was the last time you followed Rule 3? She had a point. I'd been spending more and more time at the office, not because Harbor needed me there 18 hours a day, but because I genuinely enjoyed the work. It was the kind of problem that successful people were supposed to have, the kind that looked good in magazine profiles about work-life balance. But sitting here with Grace sleeping against my chest, listening to her little snores and feeling the rise and fall of her breathing, I realized that Maya was right. Grace wouldn't remember the late nights I spent perfecting code or the weekend meetings I took to close deals. She'd remember whether I was present for the moments that mattered to her. "I've been thinking about something," Dad said, folding his papers and setting them aside. "About legacy and what we leave behind. Deep thoughts for a Tuesday evening." It's been a year of deep thoughts. Having a granddaughter does that to a man. He leaned back in his rocking chair, looking out over the gardens that his grandfather had planted and his father had expanded, and he had maintained through decades of economic upheaval and personal triumph. "I spent most of my life thinking that success was about what you could build, how much you could accumulate, how many people knew your name. And now I think success is about who you are when nobody's keeping score, about whether the people you love feel loved, about whether you sleep well at night because you've spent your day doing things that matter." Grace stirred again, making the little sighing sound that meant she was transitioning from deep sleep to the lighter doze that would eventually wake her up completely. I stood carefully, rocking her gently while walking to the edge of the porch where the evening air was cooler. The Vance estate stretched out before us, 37 acres of perfectly maintained grounds that had been in our family for over a century. I'd grown up thinking this place was normal, then spent my 20s thinking it was a burden, and my early 30s thinking it was a symbol of everything that was wrong with inherited wealth and unearned privilege. Now, watching Grace's peaceful face in the dim light from the porch, I realized it was just home. Not because of the money or the history or the impressive architecture, but because it was where 3 generations of Vance men had learned to be fathers, and where Grace would learn what it meant to be loved unconditionally. "Remember when you were planning to announce your inheritance at that IPO event?" Dad asked quietly. I almost laughed. God, that feels like a different lifetime. I was so worried about proving that I was more than just Sophia's supportive husband, that I had my own identity and my own achievements. And now I know that my identity isn't something I announce to 300 strangers in a ballroom. It's something I live every day, in how I treat my employees, how I raise my daughter, how I handle success and failure, and all the messy stuff in between. Grace opened her eyes, blinking slowly in that unfocused way that meant she was still mostly asleep, but checking to make sure I was still there. When she saw my face, she smiled. Not the social smile that babies learn to charm adults, but the pure, unconscious expression of someone who felt completely safe and loved. "Hey, beautiful," I whispered, and she made a little cooing sound before closing her eyes again. "That," Dad said softly, "is what success looks like." He was right. Not the magazine covers, or the business awards, or the stock options, or any of the other measuring sticks I'd used for most of my adult life. Success was this moment, this feeling of being exactly where I needed to be, doing exactly what mattered most. Tomorrow, I'd go to Harbor and work on solutions to problems that kept small business owners awake at night. Tomorrow, I'd make decisions that affected 63 employees and their families. Tomorrow, I'd continue building something that would outlast market crashes and industry changes and all the other forces that destroyed companies built on hype instead of value. But tonight, I was just a father holding his daughter, a son sitting with his father, a man who'd finally learned that presence was more valuable than performance, that being known by the people who mattered was better than being known by everyone who didn't. Some victories are won in boardrooms and announced in press releases. Others are won in quiet moments when you realize you've stopped running towards something you thought you wanted and started walking towards something you actually needed. I'd spent 7 years trying to be the man I thought Sophia wanted, then another year trying to prove I was better than the man she'd betrayed. Now, finally, I was just trying to be the man Grace would be proud to call her father. It was the simplest goal I'd ever set for myself, and the most important one I'd ever achieved. The fireflies kept blinking across the lawn. Grace kept sleeping in my arms, and Dad kept rocking in his chair, and for once in my life, I didn't want to be anywhere else or anyone else. Some stories end with revenge or vindication or dramatic gestures that prove a point. Mine ended with a Tuesday evening, a sleeping daughter, and the quiet satisfaction of finally knowing the difference between who I was and who I was supposed to be. It wasn't the ending I'd planned, but it was the one I'd earned, and that made all the difference.